Sabina, could you grab a mic? Um, Sabina has been functioning as a bit of a technical advisor. From the very first day of rehearsal, she's given the cast tours of some of the labs so that they get a real sense of the milieu of the play. She has helped them work their way through the science of the play. Very briefly, in the play, this young scientist is working on a gene-based therapy and believe that he has made a breakthrough where he has cancer cells essentially changing and then destroying themselves and getting early, incredibly promising results. So Sabina, the question I want to ask you is, the science in the play. Is it right? Could you tell us a little bit about what it is? What is that this character that James plays? What does he think he's onto? And in the actual current world of cutting edge research in this field, is this the kind of work that there are folks doing in certain pockets?
Yeah, I think the science is pretty good. It's pretty close to what it is in the biology lab. And as you all know, cancer is basically cells out of control. They don't get the signal anymore that they have to die, and they have to shut down. And so they keep replicating without boundaries. And a lot of times people now do that, try to prevent that by inserting genes in these cells that make them kill themselves. And so basically that is one approach people take, that they look for the genes that actually control that process, that the cells don't die, that genes that change, genes that normally would signal the cells that they have to die, and so then replace them with genes that actually work. And I think a lot of that happens, and some of the names are kind of, there's a lot of different genes and gets to be very complex, but that's one of the approaches people take. The other thing, of course, people do is try to reduce tumor cells in size using different compounds, looking at cell lines and seeing if these compounds will decrease, the growth of the cells and see what happens there. So there's different approaches people take.
So Rob, you have to play a leading scientist. Besides being an administrator and a fundraiser, somebody who's running an institute, you're also yourself one of the leading scientists in the field. You've had to learn the world of this play and understand the science from an acting perspective. How do you get into creating that character, and what are some of the things that you've done to make Brock come out of you?
Well, first of all, me personally, I have a fascination with things scientific. I'm infinitely excited and curious by how things work and what makes them tick. So I already sort of had a head for that to begin with. But of course, there's just such a vast amount of information and knowledge, and it can be overwhelming. The internet has been a huge source, but of course you can get so much information, sometimes contradictory, that makes it confusing. I was getting things that, well, that's not saying the same thing as this one was saying. Ultimately, personal contact like Sabina has been a godsend in terms of clarifying things and also putting them in terms of in simple terms that someone who's a pedestrian, for lack of a better word, can understand. And I think the play does that very well itself, right from the very beginning. It sets up the problem at hand when Dr. Shumway's character is explaining it's like a community, and the cells are the people in that community, and they have to know how to get along, although sometimes there's one that won't take no for an answer. And you get the sense of, okay, the cells are communicating. The science is they're communicating chemically, and which you can get into that and really understand how that whole thing works is, people spend years at school studying these things. So once I get the concept of what these things are about, it's easy to go, oh, okay, I understand how that works. I understand how then this is building on that. And sort of put those pieces together and work from that. Now, ultimately, my character is not so much involved with the science anymore. Although he understands it, he's the conduit between the science and the politics and the wheeling and dealing and the money it takes to make that happen. And that's where he puts a lot of his focus. He checks in and it's like, I see what this is now. This is amazing. This is an amazing breakthrough. He runs out and starts hawking it and starts drumming up interest in it so he can get funding. And otherwise, it's not going to happen.
Well, good. So that leads right into a question for Sabina. Well done, Robert. So, Sabina, the essential question of the play is I think there is this question of altruism. There is this young, idealistic scientist who believes he's into pure science, and he just wants to solve it in the most rigorous and disciplined way possible to follow his experiments. And then there's the pressure of the world that he suddenly finds himself in, to publish, to be the first person at the right conference, to be the first person to get a drug, perhaps to one of the big drug companies, and the money of the big drug companies that's being dangled if you say this is done now and we're ready to go to trial. Can you tell us a little bit about how those, in your world, the forces of pure research and then the forces of commerce and competition amongst researchers, how that plays itself out? And we want to hear all the dirt. We really do.
Really do. Oh. Well, it is a lot of pressure. It's two different aspects to it. Like for the university, you're required to do research and to publish, and you have to fund your research. Unfortunately, you don't get any funding if you haven't published. So basically, you have to put together your CV and you have to send that in with your grant proposal. So in the university, you normally get funding from National Institute of Health or the other governmental centers or even some private companies, but they're not going to give you money unless they know that you can do the job. And so if you haven't published anything, they think, well, then you can't do the job. So it tends to be a little bit of a vicious circle. Until you publish something, you can't get any money. So there's a pressure there, and if you don't have a good reputation, that is a pressure too. There was a lot of stories about Stanley Prusner, who discovered the BSE. And initially, he discovered that actually there's a protein that causes a disease. And people didn't believe it because he couldn't find any DNA or any genetics with it. And so they called him crazy. And for a long time, they didn't fund him. Nobody would fund his research, and he wouldn't go anywhere. And eventually, he got the Nobel Prize for discovering the prions that cause mad cow disease. And so there is a lot of things going on, and you're always under pressure to publish. And publishing is very hard. So because you need a lot of results. And it gets harder every time because there's a lot more techniques when you have to use newer techniques. So there's a lot of pressure there. At the universities, normally you get money from granting agencies, but if you're at a pharma company, it's a different kind of pressure because they need to put out a product. And so they need you to come up with new ideas, new drugs, and you need to test them, and they need to go into clinical trials. And that, again, produces a lot of pressure because clinical trials are very expensive. And preclinical trials are very expensive if they have to test them on animals. That costs thousands of dollars just to keep mice colonies around. And eventually it has to go to humans, and the FDA has to approve it. So it's a very long process, and you can only start that with something that you really know about. So there's a lot of different kind of pressure.